There is a strange moment that comes to almost every human life. Something happens that you did not choose. Someone leaves. Someone dies. You lose money you thought was secure. Your body changes. A person insults you. A plan you spent years building suddenly collapses. And for a few seconds, perhaps a few days, perhaps much longer, the mind keeps returning to the same impossible thought. This should not have happened. Chrysippus built much of his philosophy around what happens after that moment. Not around the fantasy of controlling life, but around learning how to live when life refuses to obey you. He was one of the greatest architects of Stoicism, the philosopher who took an emerging way of life and gave it an extraordinary intellectual structure. Before him, Stoicism had already been founded in Athens by Zeno, but Chrysippus developed its logic, its psychology, its physics, and its ethics with such intensity that later Stoics could hardly discuss their tradition without standing on ground he had prepared. Ancient writers even joked that without Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoicism as the world came to know it. But the importance of Chrysippus is not simply that he wrote a great deal or defended a philosophical school. It is that he tried to solve one of the oldest problems human beings have ever faced. How do you remain free in a world you cannot control? To understand why this question mattered so much to him, we have to return to the Athens of the 3rd century BCE. The world had changed dramatically. The age of the great classical city-states was fading. Alexander the Great had conquered enormous territories. Greek culture had spread across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, and old political identities were becoming less stable. People increasingly lived in a world where they could not assume that their city, their traditions, or their political circumstances would remain secure. The individual was becoming psychologically important in a new way. When the world around you becomes unstable, you begin asking how much stability you can create inside yourself. This was the atmosphere in which Stoicism developed, and Chrysippus was perfectly suited to it. He was born around 279 BCE in Soli, a Greek city in Cilicia, and eventually made his way to Athens. Ancient accounts suggest that he may initially have been interested in athletics, but philosophy gradually became the center of his life. He studied with thinkers connected to the Stoic school and eventually became its 3rd major leader after Zeno and Cleanthes. What makes his story unusual is the sheer scale of his intellectual ambition. He did not want Stoicism to be merely a collection of comforting sayings. He wanted a complete account of reality. He wanted to explain how the universe works, how human beings think, how language functions, how arguments succeed or fail, how emotions arise, what freedom means, why suffering exists, and how a person can live well within the whole structure of nature. For Chrysippus, these were not separate questions. They belonged to one system. If you misunderstand reality, you will misunderstand yourself. If you misunderstand yourself, you will misunderstand happiness. And if you misunderstand happiness, you will spend your life pursuing things that cannot actually give you peace. This is where his philosophy begins becoming deeply psychological. Most people, Chrysippus believed, suffer because they confuse what happens with what they think about what happens. An event occurs, then the mind interprets it, and very often, the interpretation creates an additional layer of suffering. You lose your job. That is one thing. You lose your job and immediately conclude that you are worthless, that your future is destroyed, that everyone will look down on you, that your life has become meaningless, and that nothing good can happen again. Now the original event has been joined by an entire mental world. The Stoic task is not to pretend the event did not happen. It is to examine the judgments surrounding it. This distinction would become one of the most important ideas in Stoic psychology. The world presents events. The human mind responds. Between those two lies the possibility of judgment. And judgment can be trained. Chrysippus believed that human beings possess a rational capacity that allows them to examine their impressions instead of immediately surrendering to them. A thought enters the mind. You do not have to obey it. An emotion rises. You do not have to become it. An insult is heard. You do not have to turn it into hatred. A frightening possibility appears. You do not have to treat possibility as certainty. This sounds simple. In practice, It can become one of the hardest disciplines a human being ever attempts. Because the mind moves quickly. Someone criticizes us and anger arrives before reflection. Someone succeeds where we failed and envy appears before reason. We hear bad news and immediately imagine the worst possible future. We experience physical pain and begin fearing what it might mean. Chrysippus wanted philosophy to interrupt that automatic process. Not by suppressing thought, by improving thought. He believed that human beings are capable of living according to reason because reason is not something foreign to nature. The universe itself, in Stoic thought, possesses an underlying rational order. This was not the cold mechanical universe many modern people might imagine when they hear the word nature. For Chrysippus, nature was alive, ordered, interconnected, and governed by rational principles. Everything belonged to one enormous system. The stars, the elements, animals, plants, human beings, our bodies, our minds, even events that appear chaotic from our limited perspective belong to a larger chain of causes. This belief produced the Stoic doctrine of fate. And here Chrysippus enters one of the most difficult philosophical problems imaginable. If everything happens according to causes, if the universe follows an ordered chain, then what does it mean for a human being to be free? If your circumstances are determined by events stretching backward beyond your control, are your choices really yours? Chrysippus did not solve this problem by denying causation. He embraced it, but he distinguished between external causes and the way a person responds to them. Imagine a cylinder placed on a slope. Something outside the cylinder causes it to begin moving, but the way it rolls depends upon its own shape. The external event initiates movement. The internal nature determines how that movement unfolds. Chrysippus used ideas like this to explain human responsibility. We are influenced by countless causes: our upbringing, our bodies, our circumstances, other people, historical events, chance encounters. But we also possess an internal rational structure that participates in what happens next. The world acts upon us. We respond according to the character we have developed. This means freedom is not necessarily the absence of causes. Freedom can mean becoming the kind of person whose responses are governed by understanding rather than blind impulse. That distinction would eventually become one of Stoicism's most powerful contributions to philosophy. You may not control what happens, but you can work on the person who receives what happens. And this is where Chrysippus becomes much more than an ancient theorist. He becomes a philosopher of psychological resilience. He understood that human beings waste enormous amounts of energy fighting realities that have already occurred. We replay conversations. We imagine alternative pasts. We ask what would have happened if we had chosen differently. We become angry at people who cannot hear us anymore. We resent circumstances that cannot be reversed. We spend years arguing with reality inside our own minds. Chrysippus would ask us to stop, not because the past does not matter, but because reality does not negotiate. What happened has happened. The question now becomes different. What will you do with it? This is the beginning of Stoic freedom, not the freedom to redesign the universe according to your wishes. The freedom to develop a mind capable of meeting the universe without being shattered by every change within it. And Chrysippus believed that this freedom could be trained. Slowly, through reasoning, through examining judgments, through understanding nature, through learning what genuinely matters, through recognizing that many things we desperately pursue are not actually the foundations of a good life. Because beneath all his arguments about logic and physics, Chrysippus was ultimately concerned with something deeply human. Why do we become miserable over things that were never completely ours to possess? Why do we allow other people's opinions to determine our worth? Why do we treat temporary circumstances as though they were permanent definitions of who we are? Why do we demand that reality follow our plans before we permit ourselves to be at peace? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, if life will never completely belong to us, can we learn to belong fully to life instead? Chrysippus understood that before a human being can become free, they must first understand what is happening inside their own mind. This was far more difficult than it sounds. We tend to imagine that we simply see reality and respond to it. Someone says something cruel, and we become angry. Someone praises us, and we feel pleased. We lose something valuable, and we become miserable. We see another person succeed, and envy appears. It feels immediate, almost automatic. But Chrysippus believed there was something happening between the event and the emotion that most people failed to notice. The mind was interpreting. An event arrives as an impression. Then the mind gives that impression meaning, and that meaning can determine what happens next. Someone says, "You have failed." The words themselves are only an event, but one person may hear them and think, "I made a mistake," and can learn from it. Another may hear the same words and think, "I am a failure as a human being." The external event is similar. The internal judgment is completely different. For Chrysippus, this difference was enormously important, because if misery came entirely from external events, human beings would have almost no possibility of psychological freedom. We would simply be machines reacting to whatever happened around us. But if judgment participates in emotion, then judgment can be examined. And what can be examined can be trained. This became one of the foundations of Stoic psychology. Chrysippus developed a sophisticated account of emotions in which emotions were not simply mysterious forces that invaded the mind. They were connected to judgments about what is happening and what it means. When a person becomes intensely afraid, the mind has already made some judgment about danger. When someone becomes consumed by anger, the mind has already judged that something unjust has happened and that some response is deserved. When someone becomes overwhelmed by grief, the mind has made a judgment about what has been lost and how that loss relates to their ability to live well. The Stoic did not therefore begin by saying, "Stop feeling." The deeper instruction was, "Examine the judgment." That is a much harder demand, because it asks us to look at the thoughts we usually trust without question. You are not good enough. They must respect me. I cannot survive without this person. My life is ruined. I need everyone to approve of me. I must have this outcome. I cannot bear uncertainty. These thoughts often feel like facts. Chrysippus would ask whether they actually are. The human mind has an extraordinary ability to turn preferences into necessities. We prefer success, so we begin believing we must succeed. We prefer admiration, so we begin believing other people's approval is essential. We prefer health, so we begin believing illness is unbearable. We prefer security, so we begin believing uncertainty is unacceptable. Slowly, preference becomes demand. And once the mind starts demanding that reality obey its preferences, suffering becomes almost inevitable. Reality refuses. People disappoint us. Bodies age. Fortunes disappear. Plans collapse. Other people make choices we cannot control. The world continues moving according to causes that do not ask what we wanted. Chrysippus believed the wise person learns to distinguish between what is genuinely necessary for a good life and what is merely preferred. This distinction is subtle but transformative. You can prefer health without believing that illness makes life worthless. You can prefer success without believing that failure destroys your dignity. You can prefer friendship without believing that another person must remain with you forever. You can prefer comfort without believing that discomfort is an injustice. You can prefer recognition without handing your self-respect over to strangers. The Stoic is not required to become indifferent to everything. The Stoic learns proportion. This was part of Chrysippus' deeper understanding of human happiness. A good life cannot depend entirely upon conditions that are outside our control. If happiness depends on wealth, then poverty can destroy it. If happiness depends on beauty, aging can destroy it. If happiness depends on reputation, criticism can destroy it. If happiness depends on another person's love, separation can destroy it. If happiness depends on political success, defeat can destroy it. If happiness depends on perfect health, illness can destroy it. And since every external condition is vulnerable to change, a person who builds their entire identity upon external conditions is always psychologically exposed. Chrysippus wanted to move the foundation inward, not towards selfishness, toward character. The truly valuable question becomes not, What do I possess? But what kind of person am I becoming? This shift changes everything. A person can lose wealth and remain honest. They can lose status and remain dignified. They can lose comfort and remain courageous. They can suffer rejection and remain capable of love. They can experience failure without becoming morally defeated. External loss can still hurt. Chrysippus was not pretending otherwise. But pain and moral destruction are not the same thing. This distinction is essential. Stoicism has sometimes been misunderstood as an invitation to become emotionally numb. Chrysippus' philosophy was far more demanding than simply suppressing emotion. Suppression says, I must not feel this. Stoic examination says, I need to understand what this feeling is telling me. Suppression pushes emotion underground. Reason investigates its structure. The Stoic does not become a stone. The Stoic becomes more difficult to manipulate. This matters especially when anger enters the picture. Chrysippus and the Stoics regarded anger as particularly dangerous because it can make a person temporarily surrender judgment. Someone insults you. You immediately imagine that you have been dishonored. Then another thought appears. They deserve to suffer. Now the mind has created a chain: insult, judgment, anger, desire for retaliation, action. The entire process can happen in seconds. Chrysippus wanted to interrupt the chain, not by pretending the insult was pleasant, but by questioning the assumption that another person's words possess the power to determine your moral worth. If someone behaves badly, that reveals something about their character. Why should their behavior automatically determine yours? This question contains an extraordinary form of psychological freedom. Another person can behave dishonestly without making you dishonest. Another person can be cruel without forcing you to become cruel. Another person can lose control without requiring you to lose yours. The actions of others create circumstances. They do not have to dictate your character. Chrysippus believed this was one of the greatest powers human beings possess. We cannot always choose what enters our lives, but we can work on the quality of our response. And this becomes even more important when dealing with loss. Imagine losing someone you love. A shallow interpretation of Stoicism might tell you not to grieve. But the Stoics understood that attachment is part of being human. The deeper lesson is that love should not require the impossible belief that what we love will remain forever. Everything that belongs to nature changes. Bodies change. Relationships change. Cities change. Empires change. Even the universe, in Stoic cosmology, moves through vast cycles of transformation. To love something while understanding its impermanence is not to love less. It is to love with greater awareness. The tragedy begins when we demand permanence from things whose nature is change. We tell ourselves, this must never end. But everything ends. And then we experience not only grief, but outrage against reality itself. Chrysippus wanted people to release that second layer. Grief may remain. Love may remain. Memory may remain. But the additional rebellion against the structure of existence can be loosened. This is one reason Stoicism has remained so powerful across centuries. It does not promise that loss will stop hurting. It teaches that pain does not have to become permanent psychological captivity. There is another side to this philosophy that is equally important. Chrysippus believed that human beings are parts of a larger whole. If the universe is rationally ordered, then each individual life exists within a network of relationships and causes much larger than itself. We are not isolated creatures. We depend upon other people constantly. Food comes from countless hands. Language comes from generations before us. Knowledge is inherited. Cities exist because strangers cooperate. Even our ability to think depends upon institutions, teachers, parents, and cultures that existed before we were born. The illusion of complete independence is therefore just that, an illusion. A human being is deeply interconnected with the rest of humanity. This led Stoics toward a moral idea that would become extremely important. If all human beings participate in the same rational nature, then moral concern cannot stop at the borders of a family or city. The stranger matters. The foreigner matters. The person who speaks another language matters. The person who belongs to another political community matters. Human beings are parts of one larger whole. This was a remarkable development in ancient philosophy. The Stoic ideal was not simply to become personally calm. It was to become a responsible participant in a universal human community. And this created an important tension within Chrysippus' thought. On one side, he taught detachment from external outcomes. On the other, he demanded active responsibility toward other people. These ideas only appear contradictory if we misunderstand what detachment means. Detachment does not mean indifference. It means acting without making your inner stability dependent upon the result. You can help someone without requiring them to thank you. You can pursue justice without guaranteeing victory. You can defend someone without knowing whether you will succeed. You can do what is right without demanding that the universe reward you for doing it. This is a very different kind of freedom. The person who says, "I will act well only if I am guaranteed success," has already surrendered their moral independence to circumstances. The Stoic says something else. "I will do what reason and duty require. The outcome belongs to the larger chain of causes. My character belongs to me." That distinction allowed Chrysippus to combine acceptance with action. Accept reality, but do not become passive. Recognize what you cannot control. Then devote your energy to what remains within your responsibility. This was not an escape from life. It was a way of entering life more deliberately. And behind all of it was Chrysippus' conviction that philosophy should change how a person actually lives. A philosophy that exists only in books has not yet completed its work. The real test comes when the person is insulted, when money disappears, when plans fail, when someone dies, when fear arrives in the middle of the night, when the future becomes uncertain. That is when the ideas have to become character. Chrysippus spent his life building the intellectual machinery that could make that transformation possible. He wanted human beings to understand the universe deeply enough that they would stop demanding that it conform to their private wishes. And once that demand begins to disappear, something unexpected happens. The world does not necessarily become easier, but the person becomes harder to break. Chrysippus' philosophy becomes even more interesting when we follow his idea of reason into the structure of the universe itself. For him, ethics could never be separated completely from physics, because the way a person lives depends upon what they believe reality actually is. If the universe is nothing but meaningless chaos, then human life has to create its own order from nothing. But Chrysippus believed something very different. He believed that reality possesses an intelligible structure, and that human reason is capable of participating in it. The Stoics called this rational ordering principle the logos. It was not simply a word meaning logic. It referred to the organizing intelligence or rational principle running through nature. The universe was not, in their view, a collection of unrelated objects accidentally appearing beside one another. Everything belonged to an interconnected order of causes. Fire, matter, growth, decay, life, death, human thought, and cosmic change all participated in one immense process. This idea gave Chrysippus a radically different understanding of what it meant to be human. We are not strangers dropped into an alien universe. We are expressions of the same nature that produced everything around us. The rational capacity within a human being is therefore not an accident completely disconnected from reality. It is in some sense nature becoming capable of understanding itself. That thought carries enormous ethical consequences. If we are parts of nature, then living well means learning to live according to nature. But Chrysippus did not mean that people should abandon civilization and run into the wilderness. He meant that human beings should live according to their distinctive nature as rational and social creatures. A human being is not merely an animal that wants food, pleasure, safety, and reproduction. We can reflect. We can compare possibilities. We can understand consequences. We can recognize injustice. We can deliberately change our behavior. We can ask whether the life we are living is worthy of the kind of creature we are. That capacity creates responsibility. A person who can reason but refuses to examine their own judgments is living below their potential. This is why Chrysippus placed so much importance on philosophy as a form of training. Philosophy was not supposed to make someone impressive at dinner parties. It was supposed to transform the way they interpreted existence. Suppose two people experience exactly the same failure. One says, "This proves I am worthless." The other says, "This is painful, but it gives me an opportunity to discover what I can improve." The event is similar. The philosophies are different. And because the philosophy is different, the life that follows can become completely different. This is why Chrysippus believed that judgment was central to character. We become the kind of person we repeatedly judge ourselves to be justified in becoming. If you repeatedly tell yourself that anger is necessary whenever you are insulted, anger becomes part of your identity. If you repeatedly convince yourself that revenge is justice, cruelty begins to feel righteous. If you repeatedly excuse dishonesty whenever it benefits you, dishonesty becomes easier. But the reverse is also true. Every time you refuse an unnecessary act of anger, you strengthen self-command. Every time you tell the truth when lying would be easier, you strengthen integrity. Every time you endure discomfort without immediately fleeing from it, you strengthen courage. Character is built through these seemingly insignificant moments. Chrysippus understood something that modern psychology would repeatedly rediscover in different language. The mind becomes accustomed to its own patterns. Thoughts repeated often begin to feel obvious. Emotions repeatedly indulged become easier to trigger. Behaviors repeatedly practiced become automatic. The person who constantly rehearses resentment eventually experiences resentment almost effortlessly. The person who repeatedly practices restraint develops another kind of automatic response. This is why Stoic philosophy was never merely about knowing the correct ideas. You could memorize every Stoic argument and remain a terrible person. The philosophy had to become habit. The intellectual understanding was the beginning. The transformation of conduct was the goal. This also explains why Chrysippus devoted so much attention to logic. At first, logic may seem like the least emotional part of his philosophy. Ancient Stoics developed complex theories of propositions, inference, language, and argument. Chrysippus was particularly famous for his work in this field. But there was a practical reason for this fascination. Human beings make mistakes in reasoning constantly. We jump from one fact to another. We assume causes without evidence. We confuse possibility with certainty. We exaggerate consequences. We accept contradictions when they support what we already want to believe. We construct arguments not because they are true, but because we want the conclusion. Chrysippus believed that learning to reason properly could protect the mind from these errors. A disciplined thinker asks, what actually follows from what? If this happens, does that really mean the future is ruined? If someone criticizes me, does that prove I am worthless? If something is difficult, does that mean it is impossible? If something is uncertain, does that mean it will probably go badly? If I have lost something valuable, does that mean I have lost the ability to live well? Logic becomes a form of psychological defense. It protects the mind from conclusions that emotions may rush toward. This is one reason Chrysippus' work was so important to later Stoicism. He helped turn Stoicism from a moral attitude into an interconnected philosophical system. Physics explained the nature of reality. Logic explained how reasoning should work. Ethics explained how a rational human being should live. These three areas were not separate compartments. They supported one another. If reality is ordered by reason, then human reason can seek understanding. If human reason can understand reality, it can distinguish what is within its responsibility from what is not. And if a person understands that distinction, they can stop demanding impossible control over external events. That produces a different kind of emotional life. Imagine a person waiting for an important decision. They have prepared carefully. They have done everything reasonably possible. Now the decision belongs to other people. One person spends the entire night imagining every possible disaster, rehearsing conversations, checking messages repeatedly, and trying mentally to control an outcome that is no longer in their hands. Another person recognizes the boundary. I have done what I can. The rest is not mine to command. The second person is not guaranteed success. They are not magically free from anxiety, but they have stopped wasting their mind on an impossible task. That is Stoic discipline, and it is much harder than simply saying, "I don't care." The Stoic cares deeply. They simply refuse to confuse caring with controlling. This distinction appears everywhere in human life. You can care about your health without controlling every biological process. You can care about your children without controlling every decision they will make. You can care about your career without controlling the economy. You can care about a relationship without controlling another person's feelings. You can care about justice without controlling whether justice immediately wins. The mature response is not indifference. It is responsible action combined with acceptance of uncertainty. Chrysippus believed this was possible because the human being participates in a larger order. That larger order includes events we do not understand and outcomes we may never appreciate from our limited perspective. This led the Stoics toward a difficult idea about providence. If the universe is rationally ordered, then events that appear individually terrible may belong to a larger causal structure whose total significance we cannot see. This idea has often been criticized, and understandably so. It can sound as though suffering is being declared good simply because it happened. But the stronger Stoic position is more subtle. The fact that something happens does not automatically make it morally good. Cruelty remains cruelty. Loss remains loss. Death remains painful. What Chrysippus wanted to reject was the assumption that an unwanted event must therefore make a meaningful life impossible. Even when circumstances are terrible, the human response can still contain virtue. Courage can exist inside suffering. Justice can exist inside oppression. Loyalty can exist during loss. Wisdom can exist when circumstances offer no comfort. The external event does not have the final authority over the moral quality of the person experiencing it. This distinction allowed Stoicism to remain active rather than fatalistic. If everything is fated, why bother doing anything? Chrysippus' answer was that your actions are themselves part of the chain of causes. If you are destined to recover, your effort may be part of the recovery. If you are destined to help someone, your decision to help is part of what makes that future happen. Fate does not mean sitting motionless and waiting for events. Your choices belong to the causal structure of the universe too. This became an important Stoic response to fatalism. Imagine a doctor telling a patient, "You will recover." The patient could still need medicine. The medicine does not contradict the prediction. It is part of the process through which the predicted outcome occurs. Likewise, if an event is destined to happen through a person's choices, those choices remain real causes. This allowed Chrysippus to defend both causation and responsibility. The universe has order. Human action exists within that order. And because our judgments influence our actions, cultivating our judgments matters. This brings us back to the individual. The Stoic project is not to become someone who never experiences difficulty. It is to become someone whose character does not depend upon difficulty disappearing. A person may lose wealth and remain generous. They may lose status and remain honorable. They may encounter hostility and remain just. They may face uncertainty and remain rational. They may experience grief and still continue loving. The goal is not invulnerability in the physical sense. It is moral stability. And perhaps the most profound part of Chrysippus' philosophy is that he did not locate this stability in some supernatural escape from ordinary life. He located it in understanding. Understand what an event is. Understand what your mind is adding to it. Understand what belongs to your responsibility. Understand what is not. Understand the difference between preference and necessity. Understand the difference between pain and moral defeat. Understand that another person's behavior does not automatically determine your own. Understand that everything external is temporary. And then, having understood these things, practice living accordingly. That final word matters. Practice. Because Chrysippus knew that a person can understand an idea intellectually and still fail to live by it. We all do this. We know anger can make things worse, yet we become angry. We know comparison destroys peace, yet we compare. We know uncertainty is unavoidable, yet we demand guarantees. We know death is inevitable, yet we live as though it were an outrageous interruption. Philosophy becomes real only when knowledge survives contact with life. Chrysippus spent his life trying to build a philosophy strong enough for that contact. Not a philosophy for perfect circumstances, a philosophy for ordinary human beings living inside an uncontrollable universe, trying to remain rational, decent, and free. Chrysippus' philosophy ultimately returns to the question with which his entire intellectual life began. How can a human being live well in a world that will never completely obey human wishes? His answer was not to escape the world. It was to understand our place within it. We arrive in life wanting things almost immediately. We want safety. We want affection. We want recognition. We want our plans to succeed. We want the people we love to remain with us. We want our bodies to remain healthy, our possessions secure, our reputations intact, and our futures predictable. There is nothing strange about these desires. The problem begins when we turn them into demands. I must succeed. They must love me. I must not become ill. Nobody should disrespect me. This relationship must last. This plan must work. Nothing important should ever be taken away. The universe makes no such promises. And Chrysippus understood that much of human misery comes from trying to force reality to provide guarantees it never offered. The Stoic therefore learns a difficult form of acceptance. Not passive resignation, not weakness, not the abandonment of ambition. Acceptance means seeing reality clearly enough that action begins from what actually exists rather than from what we wish existed. If something can be changed, work to change it. If something can be improved, improve it. If someone needs help, help them. If injustice can be resisted, resist it. But when the boundary of your influence is reached, do not continue destroying yourself by demanding control over what belongs to forces beyond you. This distinction gives Stoicism its unusual combination of strength and calm. The Stoic does not say, nothing matters. The Stoic says, some things matter precisely because they are within my responsibility. My judgment matters. My intentions matter. My choices matter. My treatment of other people matters. My honesty matters. My courage matters. The final outcome may not belong entirely to me, but the quality of my participation does. That idea allows a person to act without becoming psychologically enslaved to results. A writer can write without demanding that every reader admire the work. A teacher can teach without controlling whether every student understands. A parent can guide a child without controlling the person that child eventually becomes. A citizen can defend justice without knowing whether society will immediately change. A human being can love without possessing, can work without worshiping success, can struggle without demanding certainty. This is not a small psychological adjustment. It changes the meaning of life itself. Instead of asking constantly, how can I make everything happen the way I want? The person begins asking, given the world as it actually is, what is the best response available to me? That question creates room for dignity. Chrysippus also understood that human beings belong to one another. His Stoicism was never merely a private technique for becoming calm while ignoring everyone else. If reason is shared among human beings, then our moral world must extend beyond ourselves. We are born into relationships. We depend upon people we have never met. The food we eat, the language we speak, the knowledge we possess, the buildings we inhabit, and the institutions surrounding us all come from countless other human beings. The fantasy of complete independence is therefore impossible. Human beings are social creatures. To live according to nature is partly to live responsibly among other people. This means that the Stoic ideal is not the isolated individual sitting peacefully above the suffering of the world. It is the person who can remain internally steady while still participating fully in human life. Help someone. Tell the truth. Fulfill your responsibilities. Defend what is right. Love people. Build something worthwhile. Then accept that the outcome will never be completely yours. That is the balance. Chrysippus' own life eventually came to an end in Athens around the 3rd century BCE. but his writings themselves largely disappeared. Ancient sources say he produced an enormous body of philosophical work, covering logic, ethics, physics, language, theology, and human psychology. Most of those books have not survived intact, and yet the ideas survived. They survived through later Stoics, through teachers who preserved his arguments, through fragments quoted by opponents, through thinkers who disagreed with him but were forced to respond to the system he had constructed. His influence became so immense that later generations could inherit Stoicism without always realizing how much of its intellectual structure had been shaped by him. Seneca would later explore Stoic ethics in a deeply personal voice. Epictetus would transform Stoic discipline into practical instruction. Marcus Aurelius would carry Stoic reflection into the private thoughts of a Roman emperor. But beneath much of this later tradition stood the architecture Chrysippus had helped construct. And perhaps that is why his philosophy still feels strangely alive. The problems have changed in appearance, but not in structure. We still become anxious about things we cannot control. We still confuse other people's opinions with our own worth. We still mistake desire for necessity. We still imagine that happiness will finally arrive once circumstances become perfect. We still believe that if we can control enough of the world, uncertainty will disappear. It never does. There will always be something beyond our command. Another person's decision, a sudden illness, an economic collapse, a broken relationship, a missed opportunity, an unexpected death, the future itself. Chrysippus does not tell us how to eliminate these realities. He asks us to become the kind of person who can meet them without surrendering everything that makes life valuable. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming less confused by emotion. It does not mean refusing to love. It means loving without pretending that possession can defeat mortality. It does not mean abandoning ambition. It means pursuing excellence without making your entire identity dependent upon victory. It does not mean accepting injustice. It means resisting injustice without allowing hatred to destroy the person doing the resisting. And it does not mean pretending suffering is pleasant. It means refusing to let suffering have the final word about who you are. This may be the deepest lesson within Chrysippus philosophy. We often imagine freedom as having enough power to make reality obey us. Chrysippus offered another definition. Freedom is the ability to remain governed by reason when reality refuses to obey you. That is a much harder freedom. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be granted by a government. It cannot be guaranteed by wealth. It cannot be taken away simply because circumstances change. A person can lose almost everything external and still possess the ability to decide whether bitterness or dignity will shape what comes next. The universe remains outside our command. Other people remain unpredictable. Time continues moving. The body ages. Fortune changes. Death waits somewhere beyond every plan we make. But within that immense order, there remains one small territory that deserves our attention. The judgment we make, the choice we take, the character we practice. And perhaps that is why Chrysippus' philosophy remains so powerful after more than 2,000 years. He did not promise human beings a world without suffering. He offered something more realistic, a way of becoming stronger than the demand that life always be easy, a way of caring deeply without becoming possessed by what we cannot keep, a way of acting courageously without requiring victory, a way of accepting fate without becoming passive, a way of understanding that the universe does not owe us the life we imagined, while still choosing to live the life we have with intelligence, dignity, courage, and purpose. The world will continue changing. Things we love will eventually change. Plans will fail. Unexpected doors will open. Others will praise us and criticize us. Fortune will arrive and disappear. And through all of it, the central Stoic question remains. Not, how do I make life obey me? But, how should I live, knowing that it never will? For Chrysippus, the answer was simple in principle, even if extraordinarily difficult in practice. Understand reality. Train the mind. Govern yourself. Act well. Accept what is beyond you. And then return, again and again, to the only part of life that can truly become your own, the character with which you meet everything that comes. Chrysippus begins his philosophy with a question at the heart of Stoicism. What does it mean to live well in a world that does not obey our wishes? Human beings make plans, form attachments, pursue success, and try to protect the things they love. Yet events constantly move beyond their control. People become ill, fortunes change, relationships end, political circumstances shift, and unexpected events interrupt even the most carefully prepared life. Chrysippus does not respond by telling us to become indifferent to life. He asks us to understand the difference between what belongs to our own judgment and what belongs to the wider order of nature. For him, the good life begins with reason. Human beings are not merely creatures driven by appetite and fear. They possess the ability to examine their impressions, question their first reactions, and decide whether those reactions deserve their agreement. Something happens, and immediately the mind forms an impression about it. Someone insults us, and anger appears. We lose something valuable, and grief rises. We receive praise, and pride follows. The first reaction may arrive without permission, but Chrysippus believes we do not have to surrender our judgment to it. This distinction is central to his understanding of freedom. A person may have very little control over external circumstances while still possessing control over how they judge those circumstances. The world can place obstacles in our path, but it cannot automatically decide what those obstacles mean to us. The mind participates in that interpretation. This does not mean pretending that painful events are pleasant. Chrysippus is not asking people to deny reality. Loss is loss. Illness is illness. Failure is failure. His point is that the event itself and our judgment about the event are not identical. Between what happens and what we make of it lies the activity of the mind. That is why impressions must be examined before they become beliefs. An impression can feel completely convincing while still being mistaken. Fear can make a possibility appear certain. Anger can make another person seem entirely malicious. Desire can make an object appear far more valuable than it really is. Wisdom requires creating a small space between the appearance and the conclusion. Chrysippus sees this as one of the great achievements of philosophy. The untrained mind reacts immediately. The trained mind pauses. It asks whether the impression is accurate, whether the judgment is reasonable, and whether the response will lead toward a better life. This discipline is connected to the Stoic idea that virtue is the only true good. Wealth, health, reputation, comfort, and social position can all be useful, but none of them guarantees a good life. They can belong to a wise person or a foolish person. A wealthy person may be dishonest. A poor person may be honorable. A healthy person may behave terribly. Someone facing illness may still possess courage and dignity. For Chrysippus, what matters most is therefore not what a person possesses, but how they use their reason. External circumstances can change without warning. Character is something a person actively develops. This gives Stoicism its unusual understanding of freedom. Freedom does not mean getting everything we want. If freedom depended upon that, almost everyone would be a prisoner because reality will always refuse some of our demands. True freedom means no longer allowing every external event to determine the condition of the mind. A person who needs constant success to feel worthy is dependent upon success. A person who requires universal approval is dependent upon other people's opinions. A person who believes happiness is impossible without a particular possession has handed their peace of mind to something outside themselves. Chrysippus wants people to become less vulnerable to this kind of dependence. Yet this does not mean withdrawing from the world. Stoicism is often misunderstood as a philosophy of emotional isolation, but Chrysippus sees human beings as naturally connected to one another. We are rational creatures living among other rational creatures. Our ability to reason gives us responsibilities toward family, community, and humanity as a whole. Justice, therefore, becomes inseparable from wisdom. A person cannot claim to live according to reason while deliberately harming others for selfish advantage. If reason teaches us that human beings share a common nature, then our lives cannot be organized entirely around private interest. Cooperation is not a weakness. It is part of what human beings are capable of at their best. This broader social vision also explains why Stoicism does not treat external success as the measure of a person's worth. A ruler and an ordinary citizen possess the same fundamental capacity for virtue. A wealthy person and a poor person can both act courageously. Someone with enormous influence can behave foolishly, while someone almost completely unknown can live with extraordinary wisdom. Chrysippus also develops a sophisticated understanding of emotion. Stoicism does not simply say that emotions are bad. Instead, it asks where destructive emotions come from. Anger, fear, excessive desire, and despair often involve judgments about what is good or bad. If the mind mistakenly believes that losing wealth is a disaster beyond all proportion, fear and distress naturally follow. Correct the judgment, and the emotional response can begin to change. This does not make human beings emotionless. Chrysippus recognizes that there are natural responses to events. The important question is whether those responses are allowed to become irrational judgments that control behavior. A mature person can experience affection, concern, and even sorrow while maintaining enough clarity to act wisely. The deeper aim is not emotional emptiness. It is inner order. For Chrysippus, reason should become the organizing principle of life. It should guide desire rather than being dragged behind it. It should examine fear rather than obey it. It should transform anger into measured action rather than allowing anger to decide what happens next. And beneath all of this lies his confidence that the universe itself is not a meaningless collection of disconnected events. Nature possesses an order that human beings may not always understand, but they can learn to live within it. We are part of something larger than our private concerns. The wise person, therefore, does not spend their life demanding that reality conform perfectly to personal wishes. They learn to cooperate with reality. They act where action is possible, accept what cannot be changed, and devote their energy to developing the one thing that remains within their responsibility, the quality of their own judgment. This is the beginning of Chrysippus philosophy. Life will continue to change. Fortune will continue to rise and fall. People will disappoint us, plans will fail, and unexpected events will arrive. The philosophical task is not to create a world where nothing painful happens. It is to develop a mind capable of meeting whatever happens without surrendering its reason, its dignity, or its commitment to living well. The Stoic understanding of reason becomes deeper when Chrysippus turns to the way human beings form judgments. We rarely experience the world without interpretation. Something happens, and almost immediately we decide whether it is good or bad, threatening or safe, desirable or unwanted. Much of our suffering begins at this stage. We are not merely affected by events. We are affected by what we believe those events mean. This is why Chrysippus places such importance on examining impressions. Suppose someone speaks harshly to you. The first impression may be that you have been insulted and therefore deserve to be angry. But there are questions hidden inside that reaction. Did the person actually intend to insult you? Is their opinion important enough to determine your peace of mind? Even if the insult was deliberate, what exactly has been taken from you? Your character remains yours. Your ability to respond wisely remains yours. The event may be unpleasant, but the mind often adds a much larger injury. The same applies to fear. A person hears that something might go wrong and begins suffering before anything has actually happened. The imagination turns possibility into certainty. Chrysippus sees this as a failure of judgment. The wise person does not pretend that danger is impossible. They distinguish between what is known, what is probable, and what is merely imagined. Fear becomes more manageable when the mind stops treating every possibility as a fact. This discipline also changes the way a person thinks about success. People commonly imagine that achieving a particular goal will finally make them secure. They believe that once they have enough money, recognition, influence, or comfort, the restless part of life will disappear. But every achievement creates another possibility of loss. The person who builds their happiness entirely around external things also creates new reasons to fear losing them. Chrysippus therefore wants people to relocate the center of their lives. External things may be preferred, but they should never become the foundation of one's worth. If fortune gives you health, use it well. If it gives you wealth, use it responsibly. If it gives you influence, use it justly, but do not confuse possession with goodness. What matters is the character with which these things are handled. This distinction allows Stoicism to avoid both blind attachment and careless rejection of the world. A wise person can appreciate health without believing that illness makes life worthless. They can value friendship without believing that losing a friend makes them incapable of living well. They can enjoy wealth without believing poverty would destroy their character. The object is not to stop caring. It is to care without becoming enslaved. Chrysippus also gives great importance to choice. Human beings are constantly choosing how to respond, even when the available choices are unpleasant. A person may not choose the circumstances surrounding an event, but they can often choose whether to meet it with honesty or deceit, courage or cowardice, patience or cruelty. These choices reveal character far more clearly than circumstances themselves. This is where Stoic ethics becomes demanding. It is relatively easy to behave well when life is comfortable. Difficulty exposes what has actually been developed within us. When someone is insulted, their ability to remain measured is tested. When they lose something valuable, their understanding of what truly matters is tested. When they gain power, their sense of justice is tested. Every circumstance becomes an opportunity to reveal and strengthen character. Chrysippus does not believe that virtue can be divided into unrelated pieces. Courage without justice can become recklessness. Intelligence without self-control can become manipulation. Generosity without wisdom can create harm. The virtues support one another because they all arise from a properly ordered understanding of life. Wisdom means knowing what deserves our concern. Courage means remaining steady when something frightening appears. Justice means treating other people according to what they are owed rather than according to selfish preference. Self-control means refusing to let immediate impulses overrule sound judgment. These qualities are different expressions of the same underlying achievement, the ability to live according to reason. His conception of justice is especially important because Stoicism is sometimes reduced to private endurance. Chrysippus does not believe that philosophy ends with learning how to tolerate one's own problems. Human beings belong to communities. We depend upon one another for language, education, protection, friendship, and countless other necessities. To live rationally, therefore, includes recognizing obligations toward others. A person who pursues private advantage by deliberately harming the community has misunderstood their own nature. The individual is not an isolated creature floating outside society. Human beings are connected through their shared capacity for reason. Cooperation is therefore not merely convenient. It reflects something fundamental about what we are. This idea leads toward a broader Stoic vision of humanity. The boundaries that separate people politically or socially do not erase their common nature. Different languages, customs, occupations, and circumstances may divide people outwardly, but beneath them is the same capacity to reason and choose. The wise person therefore learns to see other human beings as participants in a larger moral community. Such a view places limits on resentment. If another person behaves badly, it is easy to decide that they deserve hatred. Chrysippus encourages a different response. Try to understand what produced the behavior. A person who acts unjustly may be confused about what is genuinely good. They may be ruled by fear, desire, ignorance, or false beliefs. Understanding this does not mean approving their actions. It means refusing to add unnecessary hatred to the original wrong. This becomes especially powerful when dealing with anger. Anger often promises strength, but it can quietly remove judgment. Once anger takes control, the mind begins searching for reasons to justify retaliation. Every word from the other person becomes evidence of greater disrespect. Every mistake becomes another reason for punishment. The emotion feeds itself. Chrysippus wants the mind to interrupt that process. Ask what actually happened. Ask what response serves justice. Ask whether revenge improves anything. The goal is not weakness or passive submission. If correction is necessary, correct. If protection is necessary, protect. If punishment is justified, let it be measured. But do not allow anger to become the ruler of the decision. The same principle applies inwardly. People often punish themselves for failures long after the useful lesson has already been learned. They replay old mistakes and turn regret into a permanent judgment against themselves. Chrysippus' philosophy encourages something more constructive. Examine the mistake, understand its cause, correct what can be corrected, and then continue. Regret has value only when it contributes to better judgment. This creates a philosophy of continual training. The mind is not perfected once and then left alone. It requires attention throughout life. Every day presents new impressions, new desires, new disappointments, and new opportunities to practice wisdom. The goal is not to reach a state where nothing disturbs you. The goal is to become increasingly capable of meeting disturbances without abandoning reason. For Chrysippus, that is where genuine freedom begins. Freedom is not the power to arrange the universe according to personal preference. It is the ability to remain responsible for one's own judgment even when the universe refuses to cooperate. A person who develops this ability may still experience hardship, grief, uncertainty, and loss. But those experiences no longer possess unlimited power over the quality of their character. The world remains outside our complete control. Our response to it does not. And within that narrow space of responsibility lies an extraordinary possibility. The possibility of becoming the kind of person who can face changing circumstances without constantly changing their principles. Chrysippus takes this distinction between what happens and how we judge what happens even further. For him, a human life becomes more stable when a person stops demanding that reality satisfy every personal preference. The world does not exist to protect our plans. Other people do not exist to confirm our opinions. Fortune does not promise to preserve what we have. Once this is understood, disappointment begins to lose some of its power. This does not mean becoming passive. Stoicism is not an instruction to sit quietly while everything happens around you. A person should still make plans, work, protect their family, pursue knowledge, and contribute to society. The difference lies in the attitude brought to those actions. We should act seriously without imagining that effort guarantees a particular result. A farmer can prepare the soil, plant carefully, and protect the crops, but cannot command the weather. A physician can use knowledge and skill, but cannot guarantee recovery. A person can speak honestly to a friend, but cannot control how that friend responds. In every part of life, there is a boundary between what belongs to our effort and what belongs to circumstances beyond us. Wisdom lies in respecting that boundary. When people confuse the two, they spend enormous amounts of energy trying to control what cannot be controlled. They become bitter when other people disagree, frightened when circumstances change, and ashamed when outcomes do not match their intentions. Chrysippus wants the mind to become more precise. Give your full attention to the part that belongs to you. Do not demand ownership over the rest. This way of thinking also changes the meaning of failure. Failure can be painful, but it does not automatically make the person who experiences it a failure. The outcome of an action and the quality of the effort are not always the same. Someone can act intelligently and honestly and still lose. Another person can succeed through luck, manipulation, or circumstances entirely outside their control. If success alone determined worth, then character would become dependent upon fortune. Chrysippus refuses that conclusion. What matters is the quality of the choice. Did you act with sound judgment? Did you remain honest? Did you treat others fairly? Did you respond to difficulty without abandoning your principles? These questions remain meaningful even when circumstances produce an unwanted result. This gives Stoic philosophy a particular kind of resilience. The wise person does not expect life to be easy. They expect life to be uncertain. That expectation changes everything. A difficult event may still hurt, but it no longer feels like a betrayal of the natural order. The person understands that change is part of existence. Everything we possess is temporary. Bodies change. Relationships change. Wealth changes hands. Political systems rise and disappear. Even the places we consider permanent are eventually transformed. Chrysippus sees this impermanence not as a reason for despair, but as a reason to stop pretending that permanence is something the world has promised. Appreciation becomes deeper when it is separated from possession. We can love someone without pretending that we own their presence forever. We can enjoy health while remembering that it will not last indefinitely. We can value a peaceful period without assuming that difficulty will never return. The wise person does not need to make temporary things permanent in order to appreciate them. This attitude also influences the Stoic understanding of death. Death is not treated as a personal insult committed by the universe. It is part of the same natural process that gives rise to everything else. Human beings resist this because they naturally want their individual existence to continue. Yet refusing to acknowledge mortality cannot remove it. Accepting the fact allows a person to think more clearly about how the limited time available should be used. A life becomes more valuable, not less, when its limits are understood. If time were endless, there would be little urgency to develop character or repair relationships. Knowing that life is temporary can encourage a person to stop postponing what matters. Speak honestly. Fulfill responsibilities. Learn while learning is possible. Treat others well while they are still present. Chrysippus also develops a sophisticated understanding of the universe. Stoic thought sees nature as an ordered whole rather than a meaningless collection of unrelated events. Human beings are parts of this larger system. We cannot always understand why particular events occur, but we can recognize that our own lives are embedded within a reality much larger than personal preference. This perspective reduces the importance of ego. A person may feel that their individual problems are the center of existence, but from the larger view, they are one small part of an enormous order. This does not make human life worthless. Instead, it places human concerns in proportion. Reason allows us to participate consciously in this larger order. We cannot rewrite nature to suit ourselves, but we can understand ourselves as part of it. The more clearly we recognize this relationship, the less energy we waste fighting against facts that cannot be changed. This does not eliminate grief. Chrysippus is not offering a trick by which loss becomes painless. Stoicism is stronger when it is understood honestly. Losing someone matters precisely because that person mattered. The aim is not to deny love in order to avoid grief. It is to love without demanding that the universe guarantee permanence. The same balance appears in friendship. A wise person values other people deeply but does not treat them as possessions. Friendship becomes a relationship between two rational beings who wish one another well. It should strengthen both people rather than become a source of dependence, manipulation, or constant fear. Justice also becomes clearer from this perspective. Since human beings share a common rational nature, we should not treat others merely as instruments for our own purposes. Their lives have value beyond what they can provide us. A society becomes more rational when people recognize mutual obligations rather than constantly calculating private advantage. This is why Stoicism can never be reduced to personal toughness. The person who endures hardship while treating everyone else badly has not achieved Stoic wisdom. Inner strength without justice is incomplete. The goal is to become both resilient and humane. Chrysippus therefore places the individual within several layers of responsibility. We belong to ourselves, but we also belong to families, communities, and humanity. Our decisions affect people beyond us. A philosophical life must therefore include service. We are not merely trying to become comfortable inside our own minds. We are trying to become useful members of the larger human community. This is also why reason must govern action rather than becoming an excuse for endless thought. Philosophy is successful when it changes conduct. If someone can explain Stoic ideas perfectly but still becomes controlled by every insult, every desire, and every disappointment, then understanding has not yet become wisdom. The real test comes in ordinary moments. Someone criticizes you. A plan fails. Another person receives something you wanted. An unexpected expense appears. You are ignored, misunderstood, or treated unfairly. These moments reveal the state of the mind more clearly than abstract discussions ever could. The Stoic response is not to pretend these things are pleasant. It is to meet them without adding unnecessary suffering through distorted judgment. See the event clearly. Decide what can actually be done. Do what justice requires. Then let the rest belong to the larger order of things. Through this practice, the mind gradually becomes less fragile. Not because life becomes predictable, but because the person becomes less dependent upon predictability. They learn to remain steady while circumstances change around them. For Chrysippus, this steadiness is not coldness. It is a form of freedom. The person who can act wisely under changing conditions has gained something more valuable than control over fortune. They have gained a degree of independence from fortune itself. Chrysippus ultimately brings Stoic philosophy back to a simple but demanding task: learning how to live well without asking the world to become exactly as we wish it to be. Human beings naturally want certainty. We want our health to remain stable, our relationships to last, our plans to succeed, and the people we love to remain with us. There is nothing strange about these wishes. The difficulty begins when we treat them as guarantees. Reality never promised that the things we value would remain unchanged. Chrysippus asks us to recognize this without becoming bitter. The wise person therefore learns to distinguish between preference and necessity. We may prefer health to sickness, peace to conflict, success to failure, friendship to loneliness. But none of these preferences determines whether we are capable of living with wisdom and dignity. What matters most is the quality of our choices within whatever circumstances appear. This gives virtue a remarkable independence. A person can lose wealth without losing honesty. They can lose status without losing dignity. They can become ill without becoming unjust. They can fail without becoming worthless. External circumstances may change the conditions of life, but they do not automatically determine the character of the person experiencing them. For Chrysippus, this is where philosophy becomes practical. It is easy to admire courage when reading about it. It is much harder to remain courageous when something frightening happens. It is easy to praise patience when life is peaceful. Patience becomes meaningful when someone provokes us. It is easy to speak about accepting fate when everything is going well. Acceptance becomes real when life takes away something we desperately wanted to keep. The philosophical life is therefore a continuous exercise. Every day provides another opportunity to examine judgment, control impulses, act fairly, and accept what cannot be changed. There is no final moment when a person can declare themselves permanently wise. Character has to be maintained. Chrysippus also reminds us that our first reaction does not always deserve our obedience. Anger may appear before reason has spoken. Fear may arrive before danger has been properly understood. Desire may make something seem more important than it really is. These reactions are part of being human. Wisdom begins when we stop treating every reaction as a command. There is strength in that pause. Someone insults you, and you do not immediately retaliate. Someone offers you something tempting, and you consider whether accepting it would compromise your principles. Something goes wrong, and instead of asking why the universe has treated you unfairly, you ask what can actually be done. These moments may appear small, but they gradually change the structure of a life. The same discipline applies to success. Praise can be as dangerous as criticism when a person becomes dependent upon it. If admiration becomes necessary for self-respect, then the opinions of strangers acquire power over the mind. Chrysippus wants people to become less dependent upon applause. Do what is right because it is right, not because someone may reward you for doing it. This does not mean ignoring other people's opinions completely. Wise criticism can reveal mistakes. Honest friendship can help us see ourselves more clearly. But there is a difference between listening to others and surrendering one's judgment to them. The first is humility. The second is dependence. His philosophy therefore produces a particular kind of confidence. It is not the confidence that says, "Nothing bad will happen to me." It is the confidence that says, "Whatever happens, I will try to meet it intelligently and honorably." That distinction is crucial. The first kind of confidence depends upon circumstances. The second depends upon character. Chrysippus also refuses to separate personal wisdom from responsibility toward others. A person cannot claim to live according to reason while treating other human beings as obstacles to personal success. We are social creatures. We depend upon one another, learn from one another, and share a common capacity for reason. Justice is therefore not an optional addition to a philosophical life. It is one of its central requirements. To act justly means more than obeying laws. It means recognizing that other people have interests, fears, hopes, and dignity of their own. It means refusing to exploit someone simply because exploitation would be profitable. It means correcting wrongs without allowing hatred to become the purpose of correction. This broader view also changes the way we understand our place in the world. We are neither completely powerless nor completely in control. We occupy a middle position. We can choose, judge, act, cooperate, and improve ourselves, but we cannot command everything that surrounds us. Wisdom lies in understanding exactly where our responsibility begins and where it ends. Much unnecessary suffering comes from confusing those boundaries. We demand that other people behave differently. We demand that the past should have happened differently. We demand that fortune should return what it has taken. None of these demands can change reality. They only consume the present. Chrysippus asks us to use the present differently. If something can be corrected, correct it. If someone can be helped, help them. If an injustice can be challenged, challenge it. If a mistake can be repaired, repair it. But once an event has passed beyond the reach of action, endless resistance cannot bring it back. Acceptance, in this sense, is not surrender. It is clarity. The Stoic accepts reality so that action can begin from truth rather than illusion. A person who refuses to accept that something has happened cannot respond intelligently to it. Once reality is acknowledged, the question becomes practical. What should I do now? That question lies at the heart of Chrysippus' philosophy. What should I do now? Not what would I prefer to have happened. Not what would make me feel powerful. Not what would satisfy my anger. What is the wisest action available under the circumstances? Sometimes the answer will be difficult. Sometimes it will require patience. Sometimes courage. Sometimes forgiveness. Sometimes resistance. Sometimes simply waiting until clearer judgment becomes possible. There is no single emotional response that solves every problem. What remains constant is the commitment to reason. This is why Chrysippus became one of the most important architects of Stoicism. His philosophy gives structure to an entire way of thinking about human life. The universe is larger than the individual. Fortune cannot be commanded. Human judgment can be trained. Virtue belongs to the quality of choice. Other people deserve justice. And a good life depends less upon controlling circumstances than upon learning how to meet them. In the end, Chrysippus does not promise freedom from suffering. He offers something more realistic, freedom from being completely ruled by suffering. He does not promise that loss will stop hurting. He teaches us that loss does not have to destroy our character. He does not promise that people will always treat us fairly. He teaches us that their behavior does not have to determine our own. He does not promise that our plans will succeed. He teaches us to work seriously without making our peace dependent upon success. And he does not promise that life will remain unchanged. He asks us to become capable of remaining principled while everything around us changes. That may be the deepest Stoic lesson of all. We cannot decide what the world will bring to us. We cannot keep everything we love forever. We cannot prevent every disappointment, illness, failure, or loss. But we can continue working upon the one part of life that remains within our responsibility, the judgment with which we meet the world. A person who develops that judgment becomes difficult to enslave through fear, praise, wealth, insult, or uncertainty. They can appreciate good fortune without becoming dependent upon it. They can endure misfortune without believing that life has lost all meaning. They can care deeply without demanding possession. They can act firmly without becoming consumed by anger. For Chrysippus, this is not perfection. It is practice, and perhaps that is why his philosophy remains so enduring. It does not ask us to become something other than human. It asks us to become more deliberate human beings, to pause before reacting, to examine what we believe, to act according to reason, to treat others with justice, and to accept the parts of life that no amount of wishing can change. The world will continue moving according to its own order. Our task is to learn how to move through it with wisdom,